Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Fraud Fighters Virtual Summit. Thanks for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the previous sessions, or if this is the first session that you're joining for today, welcome. We've got a really fun conversation planned. Let's go ahead and jump into it. So in this session, we'll be covering Keanu Reeves is Not in Love with You, the Murky World of Online Romance Fraud. I'm Ross Warnloff, Marketing Director at Unit 21. Quick housekeeping items before we jump in to this chat. First, this session is being recorded and essentially will be available immediately after this session concludes. And so hope you'll come back and have a rewatch. Also, regarding Q&A, unfortunately, because of time constraints, we aren't able to do live Q&A, but we definitely suggest if you have questions, fill them into that Q&A box, and we'll do our best to answer those async or after the session. So I personally am so excited to be having this chat with Becky Holmes, author of book of the same name of this session, Keanu Reeves is Not in Love with You. Becky, how are you doing? Why don't you take a minute to introduce yourself to everyone for today?
Oh, you've done such a good job. So that is me. I wrote Keanu Reeves is Not in Love with You. It's the murky world of online romance fraud. And it's very much what it says on the tin, which is a look at romance fraud, which is a very misunderstood and underreported subject. So it's a delve into that world, but done with some humor as well. So it's more engaging than possibly some other fraud literature.
Absolutely. I have my personal copy here. I will say not only is it informative and a fun read, but there are parts where I have laughed out loud reading it on my couch. My wife's like, "Why are you laughing?" And I was like, well, it's too complicated, but I'm just reading this really funny book. So certainly encourage everyone to pick up a copy sold anywhere. You can pick up books these days. So today we're going to dive a little bit into the contents of the book. I mean, Becky, you literally wrote the book on romance fraud. And so I think what everyone wants to know is kind of picking your brain on how did you get to this point? What did you learn by talking to so many people who have gone through this, unfortunate situation?
Yeah.
I think why don't you start from the beginning? How did you get into this?
One word, boredom. So during the pandemic, obviously, all of us had completed Netflix. We'd all done 100 jigsaws. We'd all done a million paint by numbers. And all I had left to do in the name of entertainment was join Twitter. So that's what I did. And straight away, my inbox was flooded full of these messages from really handsome men saying that they were in the army, or they worked on oil rigs, or they were a pilot. And there were always jobs where they had to be away for a long period of time. Now, because I had so many come in at once, it was very obvious to me that something was going on. It would have been quite different, perhaps, if one person had messaged and said, "Hi, how are you?" And it started to become something that I did to relieve my own boredom. So I started messing around with these guys, seeing how much time of theirs I could possibly waste. And started putting it up online. People really enjoyed it. And eventually I just became absolutely obsessed with the subject of romance fraud. It is so interesting. And there is so much more to it than the vast majority of people realize, including myself before I set out on this journey. And I became obsessed with it and wrote a book. And that's it in a nutshell.
Well, I think the combination of boredom, maybe being inquisitive, and also having the ability to kind of put things together and have fun with it. It certainly put you in a unique position to be able to pull this off, because I think what most people experience, if you haven't been maybe a victim of romance fraud, is you just get these benign little texts. You get these benign looking messages and you kind of think nothing of it. But clearly, if you go down that rabbit hole, if you engage, there's a pretty intentional system behind this and what's going on. And so I'm curious, can you give us that spectrum from just the mundane sort of run of the mill romance fraud scams versus the most elaborate and scammers playing a really long game? What does that sort of spectrum look like between those that you've engaged with, and then also the folks that you've talked to who have unfortunately been on the receiving end of romance fraud?
So the fraudsters who come into my Twitter and Instagram inboxes are the ones who put not really much time and effort in. So these are the ones who will blanket send out one message to 1,000 women. They will go onto a dating site and they will press like to every single woman that they can. And there's no pattern to it. All they do is it's kind of mass market. Mm. And I would say a lot of those tend to be at the lower end of the sophistication spectrum. So they just rely on numbers. If I send 1,000 out, maybe 3 women will reply. Now, possibly more interestingly, at the very top of the sophistication spectrum is the people who run the pig butchering scams, which most people will have heard of, but in case you haven't, it's a type of romance fraud where it's mixed in with cryptocurrency fraud as well. And it's hard to explain in just a few minutes, but basically they start off like a normal romance fraudster. They get you talking and you start to build a relationship. You believe that you've got something. Then they drop into conversation that are using a trading platform. Now, it can be a few days, but it can be over a year before that person suggests that you start trading. And the reason this is so sophisticated is because they have fake trading platforms. You can go on there, you can see your money in there, you can remove money, you can put more in, you can remove more. The technology behind this particular type of fraud is outstanding. And you can see how, people would think, well, I'm never going to be the person that puts money into one of those because I know my way around a system. The system's there. It looks absolutely legitimate, and really, really tech-savvy investors have lost money through these. It's incredible, really, that the sophistication level is really up there.
Yeah, I would say, if you think about the industrialization of scamming, you probably have entities that specialize, and some are more, hey, I'm just gonna focus on these mundane, high volume based plays, and others that have the different approaches, or maybe they don't go into a scam thinking, oh, well, I'm gonna pig butcher this person and do a standard one, this one. They just sort of see what's available and try to have a little bit more agility with how they're planning to approach this person.
I think what tends to happen is that the people who send out these kind of mass market ones, they rely on lots of very small amounts. And these are the people that perhaps their payoff is in gift cards or, the odd PayPal transaction or something like that. The people who are in these scam compounds, taking part in these very, very high net worth frauds, that can take a really long time, but the payoff is much greater.
Yeah, absolutely. I think some of the common through lines that I picked up on the book is that you have definitely some geographical centralization of where this fraud is coming from. I'm curious, what through lines do you see? Is it, okay, well, it's coming from a certain area, they're using, certain playbook, certain tactics. I remember reading that you got your hands on an actual playbook. Like this is a system. It's taught. It's, in some cases, culturally, it's controversial. I won't say it's acceptable in some of these places, but it's viewed as a profession.
Yeah. So when I first started researching the book, I wanted to be able to say, these stereotypes aren't true, and it doesn't come from West Africa. And, unfortunately, when I started looking into it, actually the stereotypes are true. And there is a large proportion of romance fraud comes from Nigeria and Ghana. And although Nigeria is sort of trying to get away from that stereotype, because unfortunately Nigeria, an incredible country, but when somebody says that name, that word, we think scam. But Ghana, it's, I guess, maybe slightly newer to the fraud world, and therefore maybe it is seen perhaps as more acceptable. People are starting to kind of hang out and be a bit more blatant about what they're doing. So I think there is a commonality in terms of location. The pig butchering scams, it's very much Southeast Asia. Mm-hmm. I think they are big business. There are a few lone wolves around, probably trying their luck from their bedroom at home, all across the world, I will say. But generally, romance fraud is really big business, and it goes on to fund other crimes as well. So guns, drugs, prostitution, people trafficking. The reach of romance fraud is astounding. And I think this is something where financial services companies don't really take it seriously, because they think it's just very niche and it's just some silly women sending money to some men. It's not like that at all. It's absolutely huge. And I think the reason for that is that romance fraud plays on a very human need. As humans, even the most kind of harsh of us, the most hardened, we all love and we all want to be loved. And that's something that romance fraud really plays on, and I think probably more than any other type of fraud. And that's why it's so difficult and it's so complex, because you can't put a system in place that will stop somebody wanting to be in love. And I think that is what binds all of romance fraud together, no matter where it is in the world, no matter what systems they're using, whether they're mass market blanket or whether they're very, very targeted. It's all playing on that very human emotion.
Mm-hmm. And I think you also, in your book, mentioned our human nature is to default to someone being truthful, right? And it would be an exhausting existence if, I told you, hey, Becky, I'm wearing socks. And you said, no, you aren't. You're lying about that. It's just, you can't live your life like that. And so I think that makes a potent combination where human beings just, are looking for that kind of interaction. And, sometimes you had written it's really about a moment of susceptibility for each individual's situation. And I want to jump into one example and that I found really fascinating is in the book, you spoke about a woman named Juliet, who's actually a detective. And she, unfortunately, was a victim of romance fraud. And you think, okay, if you have these stereotypes out there of who might get caught up in this, it's certainly not a detective. And so what does that say about our perception on this issue?
It's a really interesting one, isn't it? Because when I went to meet Juliet at her home, and she was really capable and kind of sassy and well-spoken and well-educated. And she was really, kicking some ass in her job. She's absolutely fantastic. And she's the sort of person where I thought, I'd love to be your friend. But she had this moment of vulnerability. Now, she is not a vulnerable person, but she had a moment of vulnerability. She'd been going through a breakup and she met somebody and he was very, very clever. And she obviously knows everything to look for. But because of this truth default theory, where we automatically assume that people are truthful with us, even if we're slightly on our guard, he was able to to work his way in with a series of, I guess, social engineering tactics and playing on her kind of her want for affection. And I think she's the one that I'm often asked about the most, because people say, as a detective, how did that happen? And I say, well, as a human, why would it not happen?
Yeah. I mean, it definitely stuck out to me, right?
Yeah.
Reading this book and kind of hearing story after story, that one was like, oh wow, that really changes your perspective on who may or may not be susceptible, and really it's more about a moment in time than a certain profile of person.
Exactly. And you can imagine, I was incredibly grateful for her, to her, for coming forward with her story, because you can imagine in her profession how devastating that was. Because one of the problems, which I know we'll get onto about romance fraud, is that people don't want to talk about it because they're ashamed and they're embarrassed. So you can imagine them being part of a profession where it's your job to prevent that, and then suddenly you become kind of embroiled in one of these fraudulent encounters. You can imagine how devastating that would be for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Before we jump in to some other areas, I want to backtrack a little bit. I mean, going back to the mechanics of romance fraud, can you explain what some of the most common instances are? I mean, you had mentioned you see gift cards everywhere. And so like on one end, you've got, hey, I need a gift card. You had explained sort of the scenarios in which these fraudsters describe, okay, they're a military person and they need money to do something, or their mother is sick, and a lot of that manifests itself as gift cards or wire transfers. Like what do those actual mechanics look like? What are they drawing on? And how typically is money moved?
So years ago, it would be Western Union transfers. That's how we would get money across to people, to fraudsters. Now, obviously, they've picked up on that. So in terms of how money is moved, crypto is massive. And when I was writing the book, I spoke to a barrister over here who said, well, look, you can trace crypto, but it would cost you more to employ, these specialist people to get your money back. So crypto is huge. Gift cards, I don't know what it's like over in the States, but here, gift card fraud is absolutely rife. So Amazon, iTunes, Google, Steam. I didn't even know what a Steam card was until I started doing this. PayPal, bank transfers, yes, but obviously banks are starting to kind of pick up on this. One thing that romance fraudsters need is a story. And there are some commonalities. So as you've said, the military, oil rig, pilots, doctors and surgeons working abroad. It has to be something where the fraudster has a legitimate reason why they cannot meet you, and perhaps why they can't access their money as well. You look at the, I've spoken to a lot of romance fraud victims, probably around about 40, and the stories are sometimes very, very similar. But there are little details that change. So there will often be somebody has a daughter in public school, let's say, and they need money for that. There might be a son in public school and the public school is going to close. Or, the themes are all common, but there's little tiny differences. It's a really fascinating world. And I wish I could write 100 books on it, all about the different ways that these fraudsters get into your heart and the different themes across them. And ultimately, I'd quite like to write something to tell financial services institutions to do better.
Yes, well, we'll certainly get to that. Sort of leaving that towards the end of okay. So what do we collectively do about that? And certainly financial institutions need to be involved there to
Yeah.
protect their customers. Going back to kind of your story of you didn't set out for your career to be a romance fraud expert. You kind of fell into it. How has perception and awareness around romance fraud changed from when you first wrote this book, or you're first getting involved, or with your Twitter handle? And I remember, you saying, okay, I joined this expert panel, and all of a sudden I'm an expert and I'm amongst this group of people. Now here we are. Like, do you feel like there's more awareness, there's more education around it? And if so, I'm just curious, that's sort of your personal perspective on then and now.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's hard to gauge because when I first started in this world, obviously I had no particular knowledge. I hadn't seen many messages around apart from the occasional sensationalized media story. Now, sort of 3 years in, and I see it all the time. But because I work in that industry, what I have noticed is when I talk to people, I don't know, say like I'm talking to a taxi driver, or I'm waiting in a waiting room and I get speaking to somebody, it's then that I notice that people are still not aware of it. And people's perceptions are still, well, you've got to be stupid. So it's that part of it that I think people's attitudes haven't changed. What I do see more of are, warnings that pop up. So around Valentine's Day, for example, there always seems to be something, from coming out from a bank saying, you mustn't listen to people, or dating sites put up warnings now. So I do see more of that. But in my view, the way that it's done is never really going to be as effective as it could be, because although perhaps it's happening more, the way that it's done is still quite stale. And therefore, I think it means that people are still not going to engage with it. You could send the same messages out every week and people will still turn off.
Yeah, that's fair. I think the message and the messenger are both important,
Yeah, absolutely.
Almost treating it like a public health campaign. Not to say that government organizations are always the best messenger, but that's sort of kind of where we are, right? You can imagine, hey, if there was more of this treated with billboards and be aware and think twice, I think that might be a good contribution to this kind of like in-app messages and warnings and stuff like that. A lot of this goes to kind of leads into where we see kind of the increasing levels of romance fraud being reported and dollars lost. I mean, we're talking about enormous amounts of money, billions of dollars across the world, increasing year over year. You still think that's underreporting the issue? Why do you think that is?
Oh, I think whenever I see a stat that comes out, I always think, yeah, and the rest. Whatever stat comes out, I think you can times it by 10. People don't want to admit that they've done something which society deems foolish. And this is something that we really, really need to address. People don't report it because they're embarrassed, they're ashamed. Over here, our reporting system is absolutely not fit for purpose. So people don't understand it. People are very concerned about how others will react. So that they don't know how the police will react, for example. They don't know how friends and family will react if they end up kind of coming out to them, as it were. It just seems that there are myriad obstacles to people who have done something that they deeply regret and don't know how to take the next step towards letting that out somewhere.
Yeah. I mean, do you have, if you think that we're perhaps creating a culture of victim shaming. I mean,
Yeah.
how do we counter that? What do you think some recommendations might be there?
So for me, I have a real bugbear, and I think you know what I'm going to say now about the term falling for. And I go on about this in the UK media and fraud world. There is no other crime apart from fraud that we refer to as a victim falling for. So, when's the last time that somebody fell for a robbery, or, oh, I went out last night and I fell for an assault? It doesn't happen. And by saying that somebody falls for something, we are putting that onus onto the victim and saying that you walked into that. Mm-hmm. Now, fraud is a crime like any other, and it should be treated with the same respect. And victims of romance fraud should not be treated with derision. So I think we need to really look at the language that we use around fraud. People don't want to come forward to report something if they think that they're going to be laughed at, and if they think that they're going to be shamed into something that's less of a crime than other things and that they walked into. I feel very, very strongly that we should be using human nature and kindness to understand what has happened, that somebody has, sent money elsewhere. What can we do to ensure that that doesn't happen to other people, that they're not put into a position where they're contacted by fraudsters? Mm. But instead, we put everything in their way and we make fun of people. And that's absolutely the way to ensure that nobody reports it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's kind of a collective effort from a variety of institutions to reframe this situation before we expect to see change. Otherwise, people are going to be just addressing it in little, pockets of the right types of messaging, and the kind of overall perspective will go on.
The media needs to get on board. Social media companies need to do so much more than they do. Like you say, it's absolutely a collective effort that needs to be made.
In terms of some operational recommendations, is there anything for financial institutions besides customer education, awareness, responsibility, maybe some in-app messaging, anything outside of that you see that could be helpful in preventing or slowing down romance fraud?
So my view is very much that, yes, customers need to be educated, but so do your staff. So I've spoken to so many people where they've spoken to very unsympathetic, very hard, bank cashiers or somebody on the end of a phone. If you don't train your employees to understand the nuances of romance fraud, what to look for, how to speak to somebody that admits to being a victim, then people aren't going to come forward and people are going to clam up. You need to consider teaching people about being a victim of romance fraud and making sure that they can do what they can to make people comfortable. Otherwise, we're never going to get anywhere.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I know there's a lot of data points at it within reach of financial institutions. Hey, where are these transactions going? Where are they coming from? That being said, it's sometimes difficult to put all the pieces together. And I do think that how we educate the staff, how we communicate with our customers, there's multiple pieces that are required to make a dent. And it's almost like an epidemic, right? I mean, I just think of the volume of texts that I get, and I'm fortunate enough to ignore them, but maybe my parents don't, maybe someone don't, maybe your grandparents, it's next thing you know, it's really it's a critical issue. And unfortunately, we're running out of time. And so I want to wrap things up here, and we will prep for the next session here. So kind of bringing us back. Thanks, everyone. And especially thank you, Becky, for coming on and sharing your thoughts. I hope everyone found it as entertaining and informative as I did. In about 5 minutes, we'll have 3 more sessions you can choose from. The first is Fraud Files Account Takeover Edition. Then we have 5 top fraud challenges facing financial institutions. Surprise, it's also going to include romance fraud and how to address them. And lastly, so you want to be a sponsor bank, what the last 6 months of regulatory scrutiny tells us about how to build a BaaS program. So great sessions on tap there. And if you'd like to learn more about building rules to prevent this type of fraud or other types of fraud, we have a great demo where you'll learn the foundations of rule building to prevent a wide variety of fraud types. It's available all day in our demo lounge section on the page. And last but not least, I'm excited to announce that we're in the midst of gathering data for our 3rd annual State of Fraud and AML report. We're seeking to make this research the most informative findings yet, but really we're unable to cover and publish these insights without people like you. And so we really hope that you can contribute by using the QR code on the screen. It's a quick 6-minute survey. It's pretty painless, I promise. And your insights and your perspective on fraud and AML compliance are really going to help the rest of the industry understand kind of where things are going, where they've been, and your thoughts on today's hottest topics. So with that, I will bid everyone adieu. Becky, thank you again so much for joining us, and hope everyone has a great day and rest of the virtual summit.
Thanks, everybody.